Okay, so it is finally time to move on to the dress for this 18th century project. I am going to use a pattern in Patterns of Fashion 1. It's a little bit tricky to figure out the scale that these are. The description in the back of this is not very easy to follow. The other Patterns of Fashion book, number 2, has a better explanation. So if you own both of them, go to that one because this one confused me. I went to the other one, made complete sense. But they have a little ruler that you can copy. I just copied it on my printer and cut it out, and each little dash represents a centimeter. So I'm using that to upscale my skirt and petticoat patterns, but I will use the picture taking method for the bodice and sleeve patterns. And I'm just gonna take a picture with this ruler right next to it so I can pull it into Illustrator and scale it up to the right size and then print it out and all that. I saw this replica fabric that Colonial Williamsburg sells, and I thought it would be fun to get a replica fabric, and this like flower pattern is the one that strikes my eye the most as far as fabrics to use. It does have a directional print, so this way it looks upside down, whereas the correct way looks right side because of the way the vines are just traveling up. So I do have to worry about directions, and that usually uses up more yardage. The first step was to cut out, or actually tear out, the skirt panels. I also trimmed the bottom edges in the slight curve that the pattern shows. I'll trim the whole final edge once all the panels are sewn together, but this gives a good start. I've made some good progress on it today. I got it cut out. I just measured the pattern to make sure it would fit me based on when I have the stays on, and it works. So I just cut out the fabric. I left extra seam allowances to be able to try it on and all that, do the fitting, and just take away because I did not have the time to make a mock-up. Don't follow my example. So I got that cut out. I had enough fabric that I kind of wanted to not pattern match, but I wanted to get a good placement of the bunches of flower on the bodice because I didn't want like 2 bunches right here and then none on this side. So I wanted to be careful with how I cut out my fabric. So I'm not sure how accurate this would have been back in the day because they were very economical with their supplies, but I decided to do it anyway. I'm also cutting out my lining fabric, which is a linen. You'll notice with these and my fashion fabric that I'm marking the sewing line with chalk. This is so I get an accurate placement of the pattern because I'm just roughly adding the seam allowance to it, but also this will come in handy with the next steps and how the pattern gets assembled. Today's sponsor is Vivaia. Vivaia is a chic brand of footwear focusing on creating stylish and sustainable footwear that is eco-friendly and responsible. All of their products are made using recycled materials. The team has established a zero-waste process in creating a seamless 3D knitted design, which is the ultimate combination of comfort and function. Each pair of their shoes is a reincarnation of 6 plastic bottles salvaged from city waste and the ocean. Plus, all their packaging is made from 100% recycled cardboard. You can find all sorts of shoe styles, from ankle boots like these, which are easy to slip on, water resistant, and have an anti-slip sole. Or there are flats, which are so nice and have a 4-way stretch, making them so comfortable. Plus, they have an upgraded insole, which has improved arch support and makes it feel like you're walking on clouds. And I just love that these have an open weave design, which allows for more breathability and lightness. Be sure to check out Vivaia and their sustainable footwear line and use the code BELLA12 to receive 15% off 1 pair, 20% off 2 pairs, 25% off 3 pairs, and 30% off 4 pairs. Again, use the code BELLA12 to receive this discount on Vivaia's website, which is linked down below. Also, you can learn more about Vivaia and discount information on their Instagram, which is Vivaia_official. Thanks again to Vivaia for sponsoring today's video. I am assembling this based on the instruction in the American Duchess's book, and I will walk through that as I do it. We start off by working with the back few pieces. So on the fashion fabric and the lining fabric, you put them wrong sides together and then turn the seam allowances in between the two, and then you do the seam that does the seam at the same time. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But instead of doing how they didn't bring in an iron, but I thought it would be helpful to turn under the seam allowance and iron it in place just to get a nice crisp edge, just make the whole process easier, I felt like. So I did that with all the pieces that they want this seam to work on. So this is an English seam. So first you put your fashion and then your lining with wrong sides in between with the seam allowances turned in, and you just put the lining just behind the edge of the fashion fabric, and then you baste this in place. You do this on the other piece, and then you bring these two pieces together with the fashion fabric, right sides together, so you would do a seam, but your seam allowances are already folded in, so you don't have anything to sew with technically, but you do. You get your thread and you go through the two fashion layer, like the folded edge of the two fashion layer, and then catch the edge of the folded lining layer, pull it through, and then when you go back, you don't go back into the lining, you go into the two fashion layer folded edges and then out through the edge of that other lining fabric. And so then you pull it and you repeat that. So basically what you're doing, you have 4 folded edges. You have a lining and a lining on the outside, and then you have your 2 fashion layers. So the 2 fashion layers are right sides together, and then you have your wrong sides of the fashion layers, and then you have the wrong sides of the lining, and then the right sides of your lining are on the very outside. And so your needle is going through the 2 fashion folded edges, catching the lining folded edges on this side, pulling it through, and when you go back, you're not going into the lining, you're going into the 2 folded fashion layers out through and catching that little edge of the lining layer. So each stitch, you're picking up 3 of the folded edges and always the 2 fashion layers. So you're just doing it at the very folded edge of it. You're not doing an 1/8 inch in or anything. It's just at the very edge, at least in my understanding of it. And it seems to be working really well. But you do want to do these fairly close together because it is creating the seam and you're not back stitching or anything. So you do want to make sure that they're tight, small stitches as you're going through. So again, just as a reminder, you're going through 3 layers of the folded edge, and then you're skipping the outer one and going through 3, skipping the outer one, going through 3. So I hope that makes sense. It was a little bit confusing at first when I was looking at their diagram, and so I just thought that maybe visual help like that might help. But I really like this seam. I'm loving it so much. It's so fun, and then you open it up and it's so neat, and the lining's already attached and smooth. It's great. So the pattern I'm using does have a lot of different boning channels. It has one side seam, side back seam, and the back. And so I think this is not as common to have as much boning, but I like the idea of having boning in a bodice. I just think it helps give a nice crisp look, and I'm all for it. And so I just went with what the pattern said. Also a note for the seams with the boning channels. Before doing the English seams on the lining layer, you fold over the seam allowance like earlier, and then you do a small running stitch a bit over 1/4 inch away from the edge, or how large your boning is. This is creating the channel as well as leaving some space for the English seam to be sewn with. So you first start with the center back seam, and then you attach to those the side back seam. And so then all that's left to attach is the front, because it's just one front piece. And this pattern has the shoulder straps attached to the front piece. So in the American Duchess book, they have a separate strap piece. That's all I've come so far. I will continue working through it tomorrow. I'm also doing the prep work that they say in the book. So with the front pieces, turning in your raw edges to each other and basting the neckline in place. And then the bottom edge, doing the same thing, just basically getting it basted in place so you can try it on and make sure they all lie correctly. And then you go and like finish up the seams. But, oh, I didn't get the seams of the skirt all sewn up, and that is just with the Mantua-Makers seam. I feel like I'm slurring when I say that. So this is the Mantua-Makers seam, which I've explained in earlier videos, but here's a quick explanation. One edge of the seam is just beyond the other, and that extra bit is folded over that other raw edge. This is basted in place. Then this whole edge of both fabrics is folded again and is hem-stitched in place, going through all the layers. When opened up, there are no visible stitches from the outside, and the inside is neat and tidy because the raw edges are all tucked away in that folded edge. All those seams are sewn up, and then I'm also gonna go ahead and hem the edge, and then I also will get it pleated up, ready to attach to the bodice. And that all has to be done tomorrow because the picnic is in 2 days. So I have one full day of work tomorrow, and then the next day it has to be all done. So, okay, so day 2 of making the dress consisted of continuing on with the bodice progress. So once I got all the pieces sewn together in the back, which I have to say the English seam is one of the most enjoyable seams I have ever sewn. I love the fact that it's so clean and tiny, and that you're sewing the lining and the outer layer at the same time. It's just such a fun seam. I love it like so much, and I wish all the seams were like that. But after getting that, it was actually time to try on it for the first time and do the final fitting. So I'm just one person, and so I couldn't really reach around and pin that side seam like you're supposed to, how it's shown in the American Duchess's book. And I didn't think that after trying the stays on my dress form, I didn't feel like it gave the proper shape that I have when I'm wearing the stays. And so I decided to just pre-pin that side seam where the sewing line is, and then I tried it on. And here I just kind of mentally took note of what I needed to tighten up. It was mostly just taking in the waist of that side seam a little bit, and then also tightening up the shoulder straps just barely. Something you might be noticing is that just the lining of the front piece is being pinned to the back. This is how it's supposed to be done when you're fitting this final seam of the bodice. You're just working with the lining and the back pieces, and then later you'll come and attach the fashion fabric to that seam. So after getting that fit, it was time to finish up that side seam. And so the way that this is sewn together is you have the 2 layers of the side back seam, and then the lining of the front piece all sewn together. And the seam allowance is facing to the outside, so it would technically be visible. This is sewn with a hem stitch, going through layers of the back pieces and the front lining. Once that seam was sewn, I realized the pattern had a boning channel along the seam, so I did a running stitch line on just the lining and its seam allowance of the front piece, a 1/4 inch or so away from the seam to create a channel. Turning this piece to the front side, you'll see that all the seam allowances are here, and the front fashion layer will then cover them up. But first I did some trimming of the seam allowances to reduce bulk. And then you bring the fashion fabric of the front piece on top of those raw edges, that seam, and you fold that fashion fabric under, its seam allowances under, and then you shape that like folded edge to sort of match the angle of the back seams. And so you're kind of creating your custom line, so to speak, of how you want that side seam to look. Mine was very close to how my underside seam was already sewn together, but it did deviate a little bit from it just to create a more flattering curve to it. Once you create that desired shape, you then do a prick stitch to secure that in place. And so how this stitch works, based on what I understood, is the distance away from the edge is the same distance that you want the stitches to be spaced. So if you're doing a 1/4 inch from the edge, you want your stitches a 1/4 inch spaced far away from each other. If you're doing 1/8 inch, which is what they say and what I did, but I did actually a little bit finer than an 1/8 inch away. They call it like a square stitch, which didn't make sense at first, but it's because you're kind of creating this square with your spacing compared to the edge and the way your stitches are spaced apart. So then you do that, and that's like the only visible stitching that you have on the back. Before going on to the sleeves, I'm inserting my boning, which is a synthetic whalebone, and I'm also attaching a waist tape. I noticed in the fitting that the back sort of gapped away from my waist, so I'm placing a tape attached to the back seam, which will tie around my waist and will pull that back of the dress against my back. Once it was on, I was very happy with how smoothly it was all laying. And now we can move on to the sleeves and finish up the shoulder straps. So on these back pieces is the main area where I noticed my pattern placement didn't really work out. It's just a lot of the same print in the same area, but oh well, what can you do? Some sleeves from this era have a vertical dart going into the hem that shapes the sleeve to fit smoothly over your elbow. But this pattern did not have that. Instead, it had a very small horizontal dart that achieves a somewhat similar thing, just not as drastic. So I first sewed up each of those little darts on the individual pieces of the lining and fashion layers. I made up the sleeves how they said, which involves sewing the lining and the outer fabric together all in one seam. So you first take both pieces of fabric and you just individually fold them right sides together, match up the sewing lines on both pieces, and then you just layer the pieces together. Once you get those sewing lines lined up, and I actually just set my lining piece with a little wider seam allowance just so that the lining would end up slightly smaller than the outer fabric, because with how circumference works, the outer needs to be slightly larger than the inner. I just did a back stitch to secure that seam, and you're going through all 4 layers of fabric, the 2 edges of the lining and the 2 edges of the fashion fabric. And once that seam is done, you then just grab the fashion fabric, one of the layers, and pull it around to the other side. And what you end up with is a lined sleeve that the seam is completely hidden and it's all done with one line of stitches. The American Duchess book, they have like the different sleeve design, which has a dart in it, and they don't do this until the fitting phase. But since mine didn't have that, I decided to just go ahead and hem it. It's easier to do that working with just a sleeve versus the whole bodice. Now here's where I was not prepared for how hard it is to fit a sleeve. I don't work with sleeves very often for this very reason. I really do not like working with sleeves and making them look nice and fit correctly, because I am definitely a fan of tighter sleeves, unless they're like supposed to be huge and poofy looking. Those are fine. But I can never get it right. And so sleeves are on this project was really hard, especially because they're pretty tight. The sleeves just are pretty tight, and the armhole is pretty like small compared to like normal everyday sleeves. You have a lot more room. Whereas I feel like the patterns and stuff of this dress at least were pretty small. And from their pictures in the book, I would say that it's pretty accurate to have fairly small sleeves. So I was working with that, and I had a huge amount of trouble doing it. I tried it on so many times, and finally I decided that my sleeve was just too small. Down lower, it wasn't too bad, but upper, it was just looking too tight. And so I ended up doing an adjustment that in their book they suggest, and it's just adding a little bit of a V, like gusset almost, or godet, whichever you want to call it, into the armhole of the sleeve. And so I just unpicked that seam a little bit and slit that V in, turned the raw edges under, and then just did a hem stitch that caught all the layers in. And then I had a wider sleeve. So it was a pretty easy fix. And then I wanted to fitting it again, and it worked much better. So basically my sleeve was just too tight at the armhole, and that's why I was having all my trouble beforehand, probably. So I finally got to it. I spent over 4 hours working on the sleeves of this, and I was not happy. I was not like, with the deadline and you're spending that much on just sleeves, it's just like, I had to calm myself a few times. So the thing unique about how you insert the sleeves, or at least how they do in the book, is the underarm part of the sleeve, you turn under and pin into place while you're doing the fitting, but the top part of the sleeve, you just leave the seam allowance free and you pin it right on top of the shoulder. But on that shoulder piece, you don't have the fashion fabric there. You just have the lining, and you pin the seam allowance in there. And the reason for this is once you attach your sleeve, you attach it to the lining, and then you take the fashion fabric and layer it on top, and then do a top stitch. And that contains the raw edge inside the shoulder. So when they're doing this in the book, they have a separate like shoulder strap. My pattern does not have that. It's connected to the front. And so I just started an estimate of like where the seam would be if you had a separate shoulder strap piece. And I just did a little clip to be able to do that transition from the seam turned out to just laying on top. Finally, I got to the point where I fit one and it looked great, and then I went on to try and copy it to the next one. Overall, it was working. There was just one point that I needed to shift the sleeves just slightly forward, and that got rid of some wrinkling that I was having. And then also I did put 2 darts in just beyond the shoulder, and this is something they did, and I felt like it just gave more room to it. And that's why I really wanted to add more width to that armhole so I can make those couple darts, because I just felt like it gave more mobility to the sleeves. So finally getting the underarm part of the sleeve inserted is a little bit tricky because you've pinned the fitting of the sleeve just from the outside. You don't want to sew the fold into it. You kind of want to get that unfolded, but then sew along where the fold should be. And so I just got a lot of pins, pinning the whole thing in place, and then could turn it inside out and do a back stitch to get that sewn in place in the correct placement. Once sewn in place, you trim away the extra fabric in that area. on top of the sleeves, you just do a large back stitch to secure the sleeve to the lining of the shoulder. And then you can bring your fashion fabric on top of these seams to contain it all, and you fold the seam allowance under. At the back of the shoulder, they do a hem stitch to secure that fashion fabric in place, but then along the top of the shoulder, they do a prick stitch. And then you can do a hem stitch, or they give various stitches you could use to finish off the neckline. I just did a hem stitch to finish off that edge. I also did this stitch all the way down the center front and the point of the front. So finally, after having spent so much time on the sleeves, I could move on to the skirt. And so I had already done all the seams on the skirt, and then I went on to pleating. And so with this, you want to pleat them all and you're facing towards the back. So at the center back, you have an inverted box pleat, and then all the pleats going out from that face that back. So I really just estimated about what I needed. And then my skirt is made up of 6 panels. And so I just estimated how much my pleated needed to measure in each of those panels. So then I just quickly pleated it up, about 1-inch pleats that are then stacked about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch away from each other. This ended up, my first try, the perfect measurement. I was so happy that that turned out. Also on the back, your point of the back of the bodice is going to go into the pleats. You're not gonna follow the edge of the skirt. You're gonna let the dip go further into the skirt. And so you wanna make sure those pleats are lined up and pinned correctly down low where that point is gonna be sewn to. After the pleats are all pinned, I then did some large basting type stitches on the pleats to keep them all in place and removed the pins. It was now finally time to attach the bodice to the skirt. I first ironed up the edge of my bodice so it was all shaped how I wanted it to be, and then I just laid it right on top of the pleats and got it pinned in place. Then to attach it, I did an applique stitch. You want to make sure you're going through all the fabric of the skirt pleats and the bodice. And so mine ended up being like an 1/8 inch into the edge, folded edge of the bodice. This took a little bit of time, probably about 2 hours to get the skirt attached, just because you're working with so much fabric. Now that the edge is secure, time to remove all that basting. And then the extra bit of fabric of the skirt that is in the back, you don't trim it away and you just iron it to go into the skirt, and that helps add extra fullness to the back. And finally, we are so close to being done. This was a late night. I ended up staying up till like 1:45 a.m. and got it to the point where it was almost done. I still had a little bit more time to attach the bodice to the skirt. And finally I called it quits, and then got up in the morning of the day of the picnic and finished up that attachment of the skirt and bodice. And then I realized I forgot to do the hem of the skirt, and so I quickly did that up with just a basic rolled hem. And then the very last step of this dress was to do the attachment to gather up the skirts. There's various options that I could do. I didn't want to follow the pattern's way of doing it, which is basically taking a long strip of fabric attached at the waist, and then it just pulls up out on the outside of the skirt. The string comes and then it attaches to 2 buttons on the back. And so it would be a very visible string doing that. And I didn't quite like the idea of that, though I was intrigued at seeing how it could look. But I decided to go with a method that the American Duchess book shows and other patterns show, and it's just attaching a loop to an area on the skirt, and then at the inside of the waist of the bodice, you attach 2 ties, and then you just run that loop through the ties and tie up your skirt. I placed 20-inch ties folded in half, so 10-inch ties, to the side back seam. And then my loop on the skirt, I placed about in the middle between center back and my front. And then I placed it about 23 inches up from the hem. Take a note on that because I actually am wanting to change it. So it still looks okay, but it didn't quite draw up the skirts enough. So with that attachment, it was finished. There's still some extras that I want to add to this dress, but it was completely wearable. All the edges are finished. Good thing, because I needed to go get ready to leave on the picnic, and I ended up getting there 20 minutes late because just a lot of sewing happened before, and then trying to figure out hair, which I'd never done this era of hair before, so I threw something together that looked kind of a mess. But it was done. I got it done in time to attend the picnic. So much hand sewing. It was crazy, but I was so happy to finally have it done. And now we can talk about some adjustments that I want to make to it before I do like my final photo shoot and video shoot. So just as far as numbers go, the petticoat took about 14.5 hours to make. And then for the dress, it took like 25, 26 hours. And then there was a good 6-ish hours figuring stuff out. So like getting the pattern made and just working with what it would look like. There's just a lot of hours. And I think I included the sleeve time in that because I really wasn't sewing. I was just messing around with it a lot. And so that just gives you an idea of if you need to figure out the pattern and how it all works, allow at least 30 hours to get it all made. But sewing time and assembly was more like 25 hours. So after wearing it to the picnic, I think it was a really good time to just see how it was all working. I got videos there, obviously, And then just looking at them, I noticed some things that I want to kind of change. And also just wearing it, I realized there's some things that needed slight adjustment. So one of the main things was with my configuration of my petticoat with the not silk fabric that doesn't perfectly match, I didn't quite make it far enough back that usually, especially when I was walking, the outer dress was just pulled too far back. And so you could see that front seam where it switched from the silk to the cotton fabric. And so I wasn't too happy about that because you can tell, even though the colors match fairly well, you can still tell. Though I was really happy I didn't have the other silk fabric that totally did not, it would not have looked good. But anyway, how I'm going to solve this is I'm just going to re-pleat part of the skirt to be slightly looser so I can bring it a little closer to center front, not all the way, but just a narrower opening at the front. I also felt like it would be a little more flattering to be a little closer in because mine is pretty far out, and if it's closer, I think it'll just give a more flattering look anyway. And then also, I didn't quite like how the bunched up skirt was done. It wasn't quite pulled up enough. You didn't really see much of the petticoat from behind, but I also don't want to bunch it up too much that it creates more of a problem of seeing that petticoat where the fabrics don't match. And so I'm gonna change my loops to be closer to the center back, maybe 10 or so inches in, and then tighten up so that it pulls it up even more. And so that should help overall to help cover up the front and also pull up the skirt more, which you'll be able to see more of the silk in the back of the petticoat where I wanted it to be seen. And then also with my under petticoat, the openings of the front, it doesn't quite overlap. There's a little bit of a gap between the front and the back of the petticoat. And so I'm just gonna re-pleat that front part of the petticoat to be slightly larger. This will help close the gap of that, but also bring the silk to be more in the front. And then also, one of the main things I saw with the center front closure is the bottom part got very wrinkly and like often rode up quite a lot, and I didn't really like those wrinkles. And so I was just like pulling it down the whole time, which I don't know, didn't feel very nice. I could put a boning in the center front to really help it, but from what I can tell, not many dresses were made with boning in that center front. So I got out the Patterns of Fashion book to look at a pocket pattern and also the design of the lace cuffs that I will be making. And I came upon the dress pattern that I was making and realized that I forgot a piece of boning in the front of the bodice. So it's not at the center front where the closures are, it's along the grain line. So it sits at a diagonal to the bodice, but the end of the boning is at the point that I was having trouble with wrinkling. So this will solve it. I just completely forgot there was one there, but I'm glad I came back to it and saw it. So I will be adding that boning, and that should help with the whole wrinkly point part. Also, there's a few extra things that I want to add, and that's the cuffs of like lace. So we've got a little bit more sewing before we call this project 100% complete. But here are some shots of the final look. Thank you so much for following along on this 18th century project, but there's more. Stay tuned for the next video, plus a getting ready video showcasing all the different pieces. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons on Patreon, YouTube, and Instagram for their continued support. Until next time.